The sharp crack of my ankle breaking echoed through the house as I tumbled down the last 5 steps, my body crashing onto the hardwood floor I had personally selected just 2 years ago. Pain shot through my leg like lightning, and I could see my foot twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn. My voice came out as a desperate cry for help that bounced off the walls of the home I had worked so hard to buy. Through my tears, I watched my mother Margaret step right over my crumpled form, her arms full of freshly folded laundry, not even glancing down at her injured daughter. The words that came from her mouth felt colder than the floor beneath me. "We're not your damn servants, Barry. You can wait until we're done with our shows." From the living room, my father Harold simply reached for the remote and turned up the volume on the television, drowning out my pleas for help in the very house I had opened to them 6 months ago, when they had nowhere else to go. 6 months before that nightmare moment on my floor, I stood in my driveway watching the moving truck pull up with all my parents' belongings. The October sun painted everything golden as I felt my heart swell with hope that maybe finally our family could heal from years of distance and dysfunction. I was 32 years old single and had just been promoted to senior software engineer at a tech company in Denver. My salary had allowed me to purchase this beautiful 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb, complete with a backyard I dreamed of filling with family barbecues and holiday gatherings. My parents had called me 3 weeks earlier, my mother's voice shaking as she explained how they were losing their house in Colorado Springs. Dad had been laid off from the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for 20 years, and they'd burned through their savings trying to keep up with mortgage payments. The bank was foreclosing and they had nowhere to go. The shame in my mother's voice when she asked if they could stay with me for just a few weeks nearly broke my heart. Growing up, I had always felt like an afterthought in their lives. Their constant financial struggles meant every conversation revolved around money bills and the stress of making ends meet. Birthday parties were rare family dinners, even rarer. I spent most evenings alone in my room teaching myself to code on an ancient computer, while they argued in the kitchen about which bill to pay first. When I earned a full scholarship to the University of Colorado, they seemed almost surprised, as if they'd forgotten they had a daughter capable of achieving something. But that October day, watching them unload boxes labeled with rooms in my house, I thought things would be different. My mother had tears in her eyes as she hugged me, whispering promises about how they'd help with cooking and cleaning, how grateful they were, how this time would be their chance to be the parents they hadn't been able to be before. My father, usually stoic and distant, actually smiled and squeezed my shoulder, telling me I was a good daughter. The first week felt like a dream. Mom cooked elaborate dinners, filling my usually quiet kitchen with the sounds and smells I'd missed during my childhood. Dad fixed the squeaky hinges I'd been meaning to repair and organized the garage. We ate together at the dining table I'd bought, but never used sharing stories and laughing. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had a real family. But dreams have a way of curdling into nightmares when you're not paying attention. By the 3rd week, the elaborate dinners became demands for specific groceries I should buy. The helpful repairs turned into complaints about everything wrong with my house. The family dinners transformed into interrogations about my salary, my savings, my spending habits. They started treating my home like a hotel where they were perpetual guests who never had to check out or pay a bill. I told myself it was an adjustment period. They'd been independent for so long, it must be hard to accept help from their daughter. I threw myself into my work, often staying late at the office to avoid the increasingly tense atmosphere at home. My 60-hour work weeks became my escape from the people I'd invited in to save. Looking back now, lying broken on my floor, I realized those red flags were warnings I chose to paint over with the bright colors of false hope. The morning of my fall started like any other in what had become my new normal. I woke at 5:30 to get ready for work, quietly trying not to disturb my parents, who had taken over the master bedroom suite while I moved to the smaller guest room. They'd insisted the larger bathroom was better for Dad's back, and I hadn't fought them on it. Choose your battles, I kept telling myself. I was hurrying down the stairs, already running late for an important presentation, when my foot caught on something. The carpet runner that had always been perfectly secure suddenly gave way, and I found myself airborne for a terrifying second before gravity claimed me. The impact came in waves, first my hip hitting the edge of a step, then my ankle twisting as it caught between the balusters, and finally my body slamming onto the floor at the bottom. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. I'd broken bones before a wrist in college from a skiing accident, but this was different. This was the kind of pain that made the world go white at the edges. I could see my ankle already swelling, the joint bent in a way that human anatomy never intended. Every tiny movement sent fresh waves of agony through my entire leg. I called out for help, my voice cracking with pain and fear. I could hear movement upstairs, footsteps in the kitchen, the television playing in the living room. They were home. They heard me, but no one came. Minutes that felt like hours passed before my mother finally appeared at the top of the stairs, carrying an armload of laundry from my washer and dryer. She looked down at me with an expression I'll never forget, mild annoyance, as if I were a piece of furniture placed inconveniently in her path. She descended the stairs, slowly stepped over my prone body without a word, and continued toward the guest bedroom. It wasn't until she came back that she finally spoke those words that would echo in my mind forever. The cruelty of her statement was matched only by its delivery. She stood there wearing my gold tennis bracelet, the one my best friend Emma had given me for my 30th birthday, and a cashmere sweater I'd bought for a company party but never worn. Her tone suggested I was throwing a tantrum rather than lying injured on the floor of my own home. Fighting through the pain, I managed to drag myself across the floor to the couch, each movement sending fresh spikes of agony through my leg. My father hadn't moved from his recliner, the one he'd claimed as his own the day they moved in. He glanced at me over his newspaper, his expression suggesting I was disturbing his peaceful morning. "Maybe this will teach you some humility," he said, returning to his paper. "Always thinking you're better than everyone else with your fancy job and your big house. A little pain might do you good." The coffee table between us was strewn with familiar items that made my blood run cold despite the pain. My wallet lay open, credit cards fanned out like a poker hand. Bank statements I kept in my home office were scattered across the surface, certain lines highlighted in yellow. My emergency fund folder, which I kept in what I thought was a secure filing cabinet, sat empty beside a calculator, showing figures that made my stomach drop. Through gritted teeth, I demanded to know what they were doing with my financial documents. My mother returned from the bedroom, having changed into another outfit from my closet, and laughed. She actually laughed at her daughter lying there with a broken ankle, asking about the violation of privacy and trust. "Family shares everything, Barry," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "We've just been borrowing a little here and there. You make so much money you probably didn't even notice. Besides, we're your parents. We gave you life. Don't you think we deserve something for that?" The number my father had written on a notepad made me forget the physical pain for a moment. $12,000. They'd taken $12,000 from my emergency fund over 4 months. The fund I'd built up over years of careful saving meant for real emergencies like medical bills or job loss. They'd been stealing from me while I worked myself to exhaustion to provide for all of us. I reached for my phone to call for help, but my mother snatched it away. "You're being dramatic," she said. "It's probably just a sprain. No need to waste money on an ambulance when you have parents right here to take care of you. Though I don't know why we should help someone who's so ungrateful." Trapped on the couch with my phone held hostage, I could only watch in growing horror as my parents prepared for what appeared to be a planned social event. My mother bustled around the kitchen, pulling out the china that had belonged to my grandmother, the one thing of sentimental value I'd managed to save from my childhood. She was preparing a feast using groceries I'd bought, humming to herself as if her daughter wasn't lying injured just 20 feet away. Around noon, the doorbell rang and my Aunt Susan entered along with Uncle Frank. They greeted my parents warmly, barely glancing in my direction as they passed through the living room. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, a cruel reminder that I hadn't eaten since the previous evening. Every time I tried to speak up to explain my situation, my mother would talk over me, her voice drowning out my attempts. "She's having one of her episodes," Margaret told Susan in a stage whisper loud enough for me to hear. "You know how she gets. Always seeking attention, making everything about her. Just like when she was little. Remember always crying about something." My aunt looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust that cut deeper than any physical pain. I hadn't seen Susan in 3 years, not since a family reunion where everything had seemed fine. Now she was nodding along as my mother spun elaborate tales about my supposed mental instability, my alleged drug use, my cruelty toward the parents who had sacrificed so much for me. "We walk on eggshells around her," my father added, carving the chicken with the knife set I'd bought myself as a housewarming gift. "She flies into rages over the smallest things. Yesterday, she screamed at Margaret for doing her laundry. Can you imagine? Her poor mother was just trying to help. I wanted to scream that she hadn't been doing my laundry. She'd been stealing my clothes. But my voice came out as a weak croak easily dismissed as more drama from the unstable daughter. Uncle Frank, who had always been kind to me growing up, wouldn't even meet my eyes. He focused on his plate as my parents continued their character assassination. The worst part was the calculated nature of it all. This wasn't spontaneous venting from stressed parents. They had prepared stories, coordinated their narratives, even produced evidence of my supposed instability. My mother showed Susan prescription bottles from my medicine cabinet, vitamins and allergy medication, transformed into proof of drug abuse through creative storytelling. She pulled out printed emails I'd sent her months ago, taking phrases out of context to paint a picture of a daughter spiraling out of control. "We're honestly afraid of her sometimes," Margaret confided, dabbing at dry eyes with my monogrammed napkins. "That's probably how she really hurt her ankle. She was probably high and fell down the stairs. We found empty wine bottles in her room last week. Those bottles were from a dinner party I'd hosted for work colleagues 2 months ago before my parents had even moved in. But truth had no place at this table where my character was being carved up and served alongside the chicken. They were systematically destroying my reputation with the extended family, ensuring that when I finally escaped this situation, I'd have no one to turn to for help or support. As the afternoon wore on, my ankle continued to swell. The pain came in waves, now accompanied by nausea that made the smell of food unbearable. I'd managed to inch myself closer to the front door, thinking maybe I could crawl outside and flag down a neighbor when my father noticed my movement. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, standing between me and the door. "You're not going to embarrass this family by making a scene in front of the neighbors. You'll sit there and think about your behavior until you're ready to apologize to your mother for your rudeness this morning." Susan and Frank left as the sun began to set, my aunt pausing just long enough to shake her head at me in disappointment. Poor Margaret and Harold. I heard her tell Frank as they walked to their car. Having to deal with such a difficult child, even at her age. "Some children never grow up, do they?" Night had fallen by the time I finally convinced my parents to return my phone. I'd resorted to begging, promising I would only use it to check work emails, swearing I wouldn't call anyone. My mother threw it at me from across the room, the device hitting my injured leg and sending a fresh wave of pain through my body. She laughed at my cry of pain, telling my father I was still being dramatic about a little bruise. My hands shook as I unlocked the screen, immediately opening my messages. I had to be strategic. One wrong move and they'd take the phone away again. I pulled up my conversation with Emma, my best friend since college, who worked as a nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital. My fingers fumbled over the keys as I typed a simple message: "Need help. Emergency. Please come." While waiting for her response, I scrolled through my missed calls and messages from work. 3 from my manager wondering why I'd missed the presentation, 2 from teammates checking if I was okay, 1 voicemail from HR. My career, the thing I'd worked so hard to build, was crumbling while I lay here trapped by the very people who should have been helping me. Emma's call came through within minutes. I answered with the phone on speaker, pretending it was a work call to avoid suspicion. Her cheerful voice filled the room, asking about lunch plans tomorrow, playing along when she heard the tension in my voice. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. By the way, Barry, I need to thank you for clearing up that misunderstanding with my supervisor last week. Emma said, her tone carefully neutral. Someone called the hospital claiming I was stealing drugs and providing them to a patient. Can you believe that they even knew specific details about my shifts and which patients I work with? My supervisor didn't believe it for a second, thank goodness, but it could have ended my career. I felt the room spin even though I was lying still. The only people who knew Emma's work schedule were my parents. I'd mentioned it in passing when explaining why I couldn't have dinner with them on certain nights. They'd been trying to destroy not just my life, but the life of my closest friend. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Emma continued talking, maintaining the pretense of a casual conversation while gathering information. She asked about my weekend plans, and I managed to work in mentions of being injured and needing medical attention. She caught on immediately, her questions becoming more specific. Within minutes, she announced loudly that she was coming over to drop off some work documents I'd requested, giving my parents no reason to object. As I waited for her arrival, I pieced together the pattern I'd been too blind to see. The alienation from family members, the attempts to sabotage my friendships, the theft of my money, it wasn't random cruelty or simple greed. This was a systematic campaign to isolate me, break me down, and gain complete control over my life and resources. They weren't just bad parents taking advantage of their daughter's generosity. They were predators who had identified me as prey. Emma arrived 30 minutes later, breezing past my parents with the confidence only a medical professional can muster. She took one look at my ankle, now swollen to twice its normal size, and turning an alarming shade of purple, and immediately called 911. My mother's protests about causing a scene fell on deaf ears as Emma rattled off medical terminology into the phone, making it clear this was a serious injury requiring immediate intervention. As we waited for the ambulance, Emma knelt beside me and whispered the full story. My parents had called the hospital multiple times, each call more elaborate than the last. They'd claimed Emma was dating me and stealing drugs to support our supposed addiction. They'd provided enough personal details to make the accusations seem credible. Only Emma's spotless 10-year record and her supervisor's trust had saved her career. But that wasn't all. Emma had done some digging after the incident. She'd found posts on social media where my parents had been laying groundwork for months, telling distant relatives and mutual acquaintances about their difficult living situation with their unstable daughter. They'd been building a narrative long before that morning's events, creating a fictional version of me that would make any future accusations I made seem like the ravings of a mentally ill woman. The paramedics arrived to find my mother blocking the door, insisting I was fine and didn't need help. It took Emma's medical credentials and threat of calling the police to get them inside. As they loaded me onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of my father's face. He wasn't concerned or guilty or even angry. He was calculating already, planning the next move in whatever game they were playing. And I realized with crystal clarity that I wasn't their daughter anymore if I ever truly had been. I was just a resource to be exploited, and when I stopped being useful, I would be discarded just like everyone else they'd used up over the years. The emergency room at Presbyterian St. Joseph was a blur of bright lights and concerned faces. Emma stayed by my side as they wheeled me through for x-rays, her presence the only thing keeping me grounded as the reality of my situation crashed over me in waves. The radiologist's expression when she saw the images told me everything I needed to know before the doctor even entered the room. Dr. Elena Martinez was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands. She pulled up the X-ray images on the computer screen, pointing to the fractured bones with a gentleness that made me want to cry. My ankle wasn't just broken, it was severely fractured in 3 places. The talus bone showed a complex break that would require surgical intervention with pins and plates. The ligaments were torn, and there was significant soft tissue damage. "This is going to require immediate surgery," Dr. Martinez explained, her voice carrying a note of concern that went beyond medical assessment. The pattern of injury suggests a significant trauma, more than what typically occurs from a simple fall down carpeted stairs. "Can you tell me exactly how this happened?" I started to explain about catching my foot on the loose carpet, but something in her expression made me pause. She wasn't just asking about the mechanism of injury. Her eyes held the same look I'd seen when volunteering at the domestic violence shelter during college, a careful probing for truth beneath the surface story. Emma squeezed my hand and spoke up. "Dr. Martinez, there are some concerning circumstances surrounding this injury. Barry was denied medical care for hours by her parents, who are living in her home. There may be more to this situation than a simple accident." The doctor nodded slowly, pulling up a chair beside my bed. She examined not just my ankle, but the bruising on my hip, the scratches on my arms from dragging myself across the floor. Her examination was thorough and professional, but I could see her mentally cataloging each injury. "Barry, I need to ask you something important," she said, meeting my eyes directly. "When I see injury patterns like this, particularly the way the ankle fractured and the secondary trauma points, it's consistent with a fall caused by an obstacle or alteration to the walking surface. In simpler terms, this looks like someone may have tampered with your stairs. Do you feel safe in your home?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Safe. When was the last time I'd felt safe in my own home? The tears I'd been holding back for hours finally broke free as I shook my head. Through sobs, I told her about the loose carpet, my father's presence on the stairs that morning with tools, the hours of denied care, the systematic campaign to destroy my life. Dr. Martinez listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on her tablet. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I've seen situations like this before. What you're describing sounds like elder abuse in reverse, adult children being exploited by their parents. It's more common than people think, but victims rarely come forward because of shame and familial obligation." She pulled up something on her tablet and showed me the screen. It was a secure app connected to my home security system, something I'd forgotten I could access remotely. With trembling fingers, I logged in and navigated to the morning's footage from the camera I'd installed at the top of the stairs for safety when I first bought the house. The timestamp showed 5:43 in the morning, just minutes before I would typically leave my bedroom. The night vision camera clearly captured my father ascending the stairs with his toolbox. He knelt at the exact spot where I would later fall, working on something for several minutes. The angle didn't show exactly what he was doing, but when he stood up, he tested the carpet with his foot, a small smile playing on his lips as it shifted under the pressure. Emma gasped beside me. He loosened it deliberately. "This was attempted murder, Barry. They tried to kill you for your money and your house." Dr. Martinez saved the footage to multiple locations and helped me email it to myself and Emma. She then called hospital security and asked them to station someone outside my room. "This is evidence of a crime," she said. "I'm going to help you file a police report, but first we need to get you into surgery. Your ankle can't wait much longer without risking permanent damage." As they prepared me for surgery, I gave Emma my phone and asked her to call Jennifer Walsh, a lawyer I'd worked with on some intellectual property cases for my company. I needed legal help, and I needed it immediately. Emma also promised to go to my house and gather important documents using the spare key I kept hidden that my parents didn't know about. The anesthesiologist arrived to explain the procedure, but I could barely focus on his words. My mind was racing through everything that had happened, seeing patterns I'd been too trusting to notice before. The way my parents had insisted on handling mail duties, probably to intercept any financial statements. Their sudden interest in my work schedule, ensuring they knew when I'd be out of the house. The small things that had gone missing, items I'd blamed on my own forgetfulness. Before they wheeled me into surgery, Dr. Martinez leaned close. "You're safe here," she assured me. "We'll take care of your ankle, and security will make sure your parents can't get to you. When you wake up, we'll help you take the next steps. You're not alone in this." As the anesthesia took hold, I thought about her words. For the first time in 6 months, I wasn't alone. I had Emma, who'd risked her career to help me. I had Dr. Martinez, who'd seen through the surface to the crime beneath. I had video evidence of my father's deliberate sabotage. The fog of manipulation was lifting, replaced by a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. My parents had tried to break me literally and figuratively, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd left me alive to fight back. I woke from surgery to find my hospital room transformed into a makeshift war room. Emma sat in one chair with my laptop open, sorting through documents she'd retrieved from my house. In another chair sat Jennifer Walsh, my lawyer, her usually perfectly coiffed blonde hair, slightly muscled as if she'd rushed here from another appointment. A police detective occupied the third chair, notebook in hand. The surgery had taken 4 hours. My ankle now contained enough hardware to set off metal detectors for the rest of my life. 3 pins, 2 plates, and a complete reconstruction of the ligaments. Dr. Martinez had done beautiful work, but the road to recovery would be long and painful. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the bomb Jennifer had just dropped on me. "Your parents filed this 2 weeks ago," Jennifer said, sliding a document across the bedside table where I could see it. "It's a claim of ownership on your house, based on what they're calling sweat equity and verbal agreements. They've been documenting every minor repair, every meal cooked, every load of laundry done. They're claiming you promised them half ownership in exchange for household services." I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. Every line was a calculated lie wrapped in just enough truth to sound plausible. They'd photographed the bathroom caulking my father had redone, presenting it as a major renovation. They'd kept receipts for groceries, claiming they'd invested thousands in home improvements. Most disturbing, they'd included a contract they claimed I'd signed, promising them equity in exchange for caregiving services. "I've never seen this before in my life," I said, examining the supposed signature. "It looks like my writing, but I never signed this. How is this possible?" Jennifer pulled out another document, this one from my own files that Emma had brought. It was an old lease agreement from my first apartment after college. "Hold this up to the light with the contract," she instructed. When I did, my blood went cold. The signature had been traced. They'd literally held the documents together and traced my signature from one to the other. The detective, a woman named Rosa Chen who specialized in financial crimes, had been taking notes throughout. "This shows clear premeditation," she said. "They've been planning this for months, possibly since before they moved in. The timing of the injury is suspicious too. Were they expecting you to be incapacitated longer?" Emma spoke up, then showing them screenshots she'd taken from social media. My parents had been posting in various groups about tenant rights and squatters' laws. They'd joined forums for people dealing with difficult landlords, positioning themselves as victims being exploited by their daughter. The posts went back 4 months, showing a clear timeline of preparation for this moment. "They knew exactly what they were doing," Emma said. "Look at this post from 3 months ago where Margaret asks about how long someone needs to live somewhere to establish residency. And here, Harold asking about what constitutes a verbal contract in Colorado. They've been studying for this like it was a final exam." Jennifer's expression was grim but determined. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we're filing for an emergency eviction based on the assault. Yes, deliberately creating a hazardous condition that causes injury is assault. Second, we're pressing criminal charges for theft, fraud, and attempted murder. Third, we're going to sue them civilly for damages. They want to play legal games. Fine, but they picked the wrong target." Detective Chen added her own strategy. "I've seen cases like this before. Con artists who prey on family members knowing their victims will be reluctant to press charges. But you have something most victims don't: clear documentation, video evidence, and witnesses. We're going to build a case that will stick." As they outlined the legal strategy, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that professionals were taking this seriously, that I wasn't crazy or overreacting. Dread at the thought of facing my parents in court, of airing our family dysfunction for legal record. But then I thought about lying on that floor begging for help while they stepped over me, and my resolve hardened. Emma had one more revelation that changed everything. While gathering documents from my home office, she'd found something disturbing. My parents had been through everything, including a box of old family photos and documents I kept for sentimental reasons. Among them was information about my grandmother's estate settled 5 years ago when she passed. "Barry," Emma said gently, showing me a bank statement. Your grandmother didn't die with just the few $1,000s your parents claimed. This shows an account with over $70,000 that was supposed to be divided between you and your parents. You never received your share, did you? I shook my head, remembering how my parents had handled all the funeral arrangements, insisting I was too emotional to deal with paperwork. They'd told me Grandma had barely left enough to cover burial costs, that they'd actually paid out of pocket for the funeral. Another lie, another betrayal, another crime to add to the growing list. Jennifer immediately understood the implications. This establishes a pattern of behavior going back years. They didn't just decide to con you when they lost their house. You've been their mark for much longer than that. Detective, I think we need to expand our investigation timeline. As the afternoon wore on, more pieces fell into place. Jennifer's paralegal found court records from other states showing similar claims my parents had made against other properties. Detective Chen discovered suspicious insurance claims that suggested a pattern of staged accidents. Every stone we turned over revealed another snake underneath. By evening, we had enough evidence to move forward aggressively. Jennifer filed the emergency eviction order using the video evidence and my injuries to establish immediate danger. Detective Chen officially opened a criminal investigation with plans to execute a search warrant on my house. And I, lying in a hospital bed with my reconstructed ankle elevated, finally felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was my mother somehow having gotten around my block. "You've made a terrible mistake," the message read. "Family doesn't do this to each other. When you come to your senses and realize you need us, don't expect forgiveness." I showed it to Detective Chen, who smiled grimly. "They're panicking. Good. Save every message, every voicemail. Criminals always talk too much when they're cornered, and your parents just confirmed they know about the legal action, which means they're aware they're in trouble." As visiting hours ended and my legal team prepared to leave, Jennifer squeezed my hand. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow we go to war and bury. We're gonna win." They made sure of that the moment they decided to hurt you. 3 days post-surgery, I was still in the hospital managing pain and starting physical therapy when my phone rang with an unfamiliar Texas area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was hesitant, with a slight southern drawl that seemed vaguely familiar. "Barry. This is Marcus Chen, your cousin. I know we haven't talked in years, but I heard through Aunt Susan about what's happening with your parents. I need to tell you something important. They've done this before." I sat up straighter in bed, wincing at the movement. Marcus was the son of my mother's estranged brother. I'd only met him a few times at family reunions when we were kids. The family rift had something to do with money, but I'd never known the details. Now it seemed I was about to learn. 5 years ago, my mom, your great-aunt Dorothy, was living alone in Houston after my dad passed. Marcus explained. She was 82, still sharp but getting frail. Your parents showed up one day, said they were worried about her living alone, wanted to help take care of her. Mom was so happy to have family around again. She invited them to move in. The story that unfolded was eerily familiar. Margaret and Harold had presented themselves as loving caregivers, handling Dorothy's shopping, cooking, and home maintenance. Within weeks, they'd convinced her to add them to her bank accounts for convenience. Within months, they were withdrawing large sums, claiming it was for home repairs and medical expenses that never materialized. They isolated her from the rest of us. Marcus continued, his voice thick with old anger. Told her we were only after her money, that they were the only ones who really cared. By the time I realized what was happening, they'd drained over $100,000 from her accounts. When I threatened legal action, they packed up in the middle of the night and disappeared. Mom was so devastated by the betrayal that she never really recovered. She died a year later, still asking why Margaret would do that to her. I was taking notes with my good hand, each word adding another piece to the puzzle. "Did you file a police report?" I asked. "We tried, but Mom refused to cooperate. She kept saying it must have been a misunderstanding, that family doesn't steal from family." The detective said without her testimony there wasn't much they could do. Your parents knew exactly how far they could push without crossing into prosecutable territory. But Barry, that wasn't their first time. Or their last. Marcus had done his own investigation after Dorothy's death, driven by guilt and anger. He'd discovered a trail of destruction across multiple states. There was Uncle Carl in Phoenix, who'd lost his retirement savings after taking in Harold during a supposed rough patch. Cousin Linda in Albuquerque, whose credit was destroyed when Margaret opened cards in her name. Each time, the amounts were calculated to stay just below felony theft levels in that state. Each time, family shame kept the victims quiet. "I've been tracking them for years," Marcus admitted. "I have a file with everything I could find. Police reports that went nowhere, court records from civil suits that were dropped, even forum posts from other victims outside the family. Your parents are professional con artists, Barry. The family connection just makes it easier for them to find marks who won't fight back." He emailed me his entire file while we talked. The document was over 50 pages long, a comprehensive chronicle of my parents' crimes spanning 15 years. There were patterns I recognized, always targeting family members with good jobs and stable homes, always playing the victim, always escalating from gratitude to entitlement to outright theft. The injury scam was new, though. They were getting bolder. One section made me gasp out loud. 3 years ago, they'd targeted my father's own cousin in Seattle. The woman had been undergoing chemotherapy and they'd moved in as caregivers. They'd systematically stolen her pain medication to sell, leaving her to suffer through treatment without relief. When she finally kicked them out, she was too sick to pursue charges. She died 6 months later. "They're escalating," I told Marcus. "They tried to kill me. Or at least they didn't care if I died. Maybe they figured inheriting would be easier than stealing." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "There's something else you need to know. I hired a private investigator after Mom died. He found evidence that your parents have been married and divorced 3 times. Not from each other, mind you. They've divorced and remarried each other 3 times in different states. Each time coincided with major thefts, probably for tax fraud or to complicate asset tracking." I thought about all the times they'd told me about their struggles, their bad luck, how the world was against them. Every sob story had been carefully crafted to elicit sympathy and money. Every moment of apparent vulnerability had been calculated manipulation. They weren't my parents. They were predators wearing my parents' faces. The private investigator found something else, Marcus continued. "They have other kids. Besides you, I mean. At least 2 others that he could confirm abandoned when those wells ran dry. They're out there somewhere, probably with their own stories of betrayal. You're not alone in this, Barry. You're just the first one with enough evidence to fight back." After we hung up, I forwarded Marcus's file to Jennifer and Detective Chen. The response was immediate. Jennifer called within minutes, her professional composure cracking with excitement. "This changes everything. We're not dealing with desperate parents making bad choices. We're dealing with career criminals who've been perfecting their methods for decades. The FBI is going to want to see this." Detective Chen arrived at the hospital within an hour, accompanied by 2 FBI agents. They'd been building a case against my parents for interstate fraud but lacked the comprehensive evidence Marcus had compiled. Now they had a roadmap of crimes across multiple jurisdictions, patterns of behavior that suggested organized criminal enterprise rather than opportunistic theft. "Your cousin Marcus may have just handed us the case of the decade," one of the FBI agents told me. "Elder abuse and family fraud are severely underreported. If we can nail your parents, it might encourage other victims to come forward. Are you prepared for this to get big?" I thought about lying on my floor, abandoned and in agony while my parents planned their next move. I thought about Great Aunt Dorothy dying confused and betrayed. I thought about unknown half-siblings out there carrying their own scars from our parents' crimes. "Yes," I said firmly, "let's nail them." The 4th day of my hospital stay brought a revelation that turned our entire case on its head. Emma arrived during morning rounds with my laptop and a triumphant expression. "You're not going to believe what I found." she said, pulling up files on the screen. "Remember when you installed that comprehensive security system, you didn't just put cameras on the entrances, you put them in all the common areas." My heart raced as I realized what she meant. When I'd bought the house, the security company had offered a package deal that included cameras in the living room, kitchen, and hallways. I thought it was overkill at the time, but agreed because of the discount. The cameras were small, designed to blend into the crown molding, and I'd honestly forgotten about them after the first month. "The system automatically backs up to the cloud," Emma explained, navigating to the archived footage. "I went back through the past 6 months. Barry, you have everything. Every conversation, every theft, every moment of planning. They never knew they were being recorded." We started with recent footage, working our way backward. The first clip Emma showed me was from 2 nights before my fall. My parents sat at my dining room table with papers spread between them. The audio was crystal clear as my mother read from a website about squatters' rights while my father took notes. "The key is to establish residency for more than 30 days, Margaret said in the recording. "Then we become tenants and she can't just kick us out. But if we can prove sweat equity and get her to agree verbally to giving us ownership, even better. We just need her vulnerable enough to agree to anything." "That's where the accident comes in," Harold replied. "A broken leg, maybe some head trauma. She'll be dependent on us for weeks. We can get her to sign anything while she's on pain medication. Power of attorney would be ideal." I felt sick listening to them plan my injury like they were discussing a grocery list. But it got worse. The next clip was from a week earlier, showing them on a phone call with someone named Vincent, who appeared to be coaching them through the legal aspects of property theft. "The daughter angle is perfect." Vincent's voice came through the speakerphone. "Judges hate to see adult children throwing out elderly parents. Play up the fixed income sob story. If she fights back, claim elder abuse. The accusation alone will complicate things for months." Emma had organized the clips chronologically, creating a timeline of premeditation that would devastate any defense they might mount. There were conversations about hiding my mail to intercept bank statements, discussions about which relatives to turn against me, even practice sessions where they rehearsed their victim narratives. One clip from 3 months ago showed them laughing about their previous crimes. "Remember Carl's face when he realized we'd emptied his accounts?" Margaret giggled. "And he still sent us a Christmas card the next year. These people are so pathetic with their family loyalty nonsense." The most damning footage came from the morning of my fall. The hallway camera captured Harold heading upstairs with his toolbox at 5:43, just as the stairway camera had shown. But the living room camera caught their conversation afterward before I woke up. Harold returned to report mission accomplished, and Margaret reminded him to act surprised when I fell. They then discussed whether to call an ambulance immediately or let me suffer for a few hours to increase my desperation. "Let her marinate in pain for a while," Margaret had said. "The more desperate she is, the more grateful she'll be when we finally help. Classic trauma bonding. She'll sign anything we want by the time we're done." I had to excuse myself to vomit in the hospital bathroom. The calculated cruelty was beyond anything I'd imagined. These weren't parents who'd lost their way. These were monsters who'd birthed and raised me for the sole purpose of eventual exploitation. Jennifer arrived as we were reviewing the final batch of recordings. Her usual professional demeanor cracked as she watched clip after clip of criminal conspiracy playing out in my own home. "This is..." She paused, searching for words. "This is the most comprehensive evidence package I've ever seen. They convicted themselves 100 times over. We need to get this to the FBI immediately." The FBI agents who'd visited the day before returned within hours this time, with a full forensics team and federal prosecutors. They set up in a hospital conference room, going through every minute of footage with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for organized crime investigations, which I was beginning to realize this actually was. One agent pulled me aside during a break. "Ms. Chen, what your parents have done goes beyond fraud or theft. This level of premeditation, the conspiracy with outside advisors, the interstate pattern, this is RICO territory, racketeering charges. We're talking serious federal time." As the day progressed, the scope of the investigation expanded. The mysterious Vincent on the phone calls was identified as Vincent Moretti, a disbarred attorney who specialized in teaching criminals how to exploit family relationships for profit. The FBI had been trying to nail him for years but could never find victims willing to testify. Now they had hours of recorded conversations proving his involvement. By evening, warrants were being prepared not just for my parents, but for their entire network. The prosecutor explained that my case could break open dozens of cold cases across the country. Families who'd been too ashamed or heartbroken to pursue justice might finally see their abusers face consequences. But the recordings revealed one more crucial detail that changed our approach. In a conversation from just 2 days ago after they'd learned about my legal action, my parents discussed fleeing to Mexico, where Margaret's cousin operated a vacation rental business. They'd already transferred money to an account there and had plane tickets booked for the following week. We need to move fast, the lead FBI agent decided. If they run, it becomes infinitely harder to prosecute. We're going to coordinate simultaneous arrests. Your parents, Vincent Moretti, and at least 3 other co-conspirators identified in the recordings. This ends now. As the team prepared for the raids, I sat in my hospital bed, laptop open to a folder containing 6 months of my life under surveillance. Every humiliation, every violation, every moment of pain had been captured. But so had every crime, every confession, every damning word from their own mouths. They'd thought they were directors of my tragedy. Instead, they'd filmed their own downfall. Dawn broke gray and rainy on the day everything unraveled. I was cleared for discharge with strict instructions to keep weight off my ankle for another week, but I couldn't bear another hour in the hospital. Emma had arranged for a wheelchair-accessible hotel suite near the courthouse, anticipating the legal proceedings ahead. What I didn't anticipate was my parents' final desperate gambit. I was signing discharge papers when a commotion erupted in the hallway. Through the door's window, I could see my Aunt Susan arguing with hospital security. Behind her stood my parents, Harold clutching a folder of documents, while Margaret performed an Oscar-worthy display of maternal distress. With them was a woman in a severe black suit who could only be a lawyer. "They're trying to have you declared incompetent," my nurse whispered quickly, locking the door. "Dr. Martinez warned us this might happen. Security is on their way, but you should call your lawyer immediately." Jennifer answered on the first ring, already aware of the situation. The FBI had been monitoring my parents' communications and knew they'd hired a bottom-feeder attorney to file an emergency psychiatric hold petition. Jennifer was already at the courthouse, filing an injunction when they decided to ambush me at the hospital instead. "Put me on speaker," Jennifer instructed. "I want everyone to hear this." I rolled my wheelchair to the door phone held high. Jennifer's voice carried clearly through the glass. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, this is Jennifer Walsh, attorney for Barry Chen. Any attempt to enter that room or interact with my client will be considered witness intimidation and added to your federal charges. You're currently violating the emergency protective order issued 2 days ago. I suggest you leave immediately before you add arrest for contempt to your growing list of problems." My mother's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the rage beneath. She pressed against the glass, her voice shrill. "You ungrateful brat. After everything we've done for you, you're sick." Barry mentally sick. No normal daughter treats her parents this way. Harold was more strategic, holding up documents for me to see. "We have statements from family members about your erratic behavior, your drug use, your mental instability. You need help, sweetheart. Let us take care of you. Sign the papers, and this can all go away. We'll get you the treatment you need." That's when I remembered the cameras. I pulled out my phone and started recording, making sure to capture not just their words, but their body language. The woman who claimed I needed psychiatric help was practically frothing at the mouth. The man worried about my mental state had veins bulging in his neck from rage. Behind them, Aunt Susan looked increasingly uncomfortable. The narrative my parents had sold her was crumbling against the reality she was witnessing. When Margaret grabbed the door handle and tried to force it open, Susan finally spoke up. "Margaret, stop. This isn't helping. If Barry's really sick, this isn't how we handle it. And why did you tell me she was on drugs when the nurse just said she's only on prescribed pain medication for her surgery? Shut up, Susan, Margaret snapped, whirling on her sister. You're either with us or against us. Remember who told you about Tom's affair, who helped you through your divorce. You owe me. The manipulation was so blatant, so crude, that even their hired attorney took a step back. Susan's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, horror, as she processed decades of relationship patterns in a single moment. Without a word, she turned and walked away my mother's curses, following her down the hall. That's when Emma arrived with reinforcements. She'd called Dr. Martinez, who came with the hospital's chief of security and their legal counsel. The psychiatric evaluation my parents were demanding had already been done as routine protocol after my injury. I was declared completely competent, my mental state excellent despite the trauma I'd endured. Dr. Martinez addressed my parents directly through the door. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I've reviewed your petition. The claims you're making are contradicted by medical evidence, security footage, and witness testimony. What you're attempting constitutes fraud and harassment. Hospital security will escort you out now, or we'll call the police to do it. As security moved in, my father made one last desperate play. He shouted through the glass about DNA tests, claiming I wasn't his real daughter, that he had no obligation to someone who wasn't really family. It was cruel, it was ridiculous, and it was exactly what Jennifer had predicted. She'd already pulled my medical records showing the genetic testing I'd done years ago for a health screening. Harold was definitely my biological father, making his claim not just cruel, but provably false. The security footage from the hallway captured everything: my parents being escorted out, my mother screaming threats about ruining my life, my father muttering about ungrateful children who didn't understand sacrifice. Their attorney tried to maintain dignity but was clearly reconsidering her life choices. The entire scene lasted less than 10 minutes, but provided more evidence of their deteriorating mental state and criminal intent. An hour later, as Emma helped me into her car for the ride to the hotel, her phone buzzed with an alert. The FBI raids had begun. Simultaneous arrests at my house, at Vincent Moretti's office, and at 2 other locations connected to the fraud ring. My parents, who'd returned home thinking they still had time to destroy evidence and flee, walked right into a house full of federal agents. The arrest footage, which would later be evidence in court, showed my parents' final performance. Margaret collapsed on the lawn, wailing about persecution and elder abuse. Harold tried to run but was quickly apprehended in the backyard where he'd been trying to bury a box of documents. Even in custody, they maintained their victim narrative, telling anyone who'd listen about their ungrateful daughter who'd betrayed them. But the real vindication came from what the FBI found in their search. Beyond the expected financial documents and evidence of fraud, they discovered what they called a trophy box. It contained driver's licenses and credit cards from dozens of victims' newspaper clippings about families they'd destroyed, and a handwritten ledger tracking their profits over 15 years. They'd kept souvenirs of their crimes like serial killers collecting mementos. That evening, safe in my hotel room with Emma standing guard and Jennifer coordinating with federal prosecutors, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My parents were in federal custody, denied bail as flight risks. Their network of co-conspirators was crumbling. Decades of crimes were finally coming to light. The parents I'd tried so hard to save had never existed. The people who raised me were criminals who saw me not as a daughter, but as a long-term investment. The house I'd opened to them in love had become a crime scene. The family I dreamed of building was a fantasy constructed by con artists who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. But as I looked at the messages pouring in from Marcus, from Aunt Susan, apologizing for doubting me, from cousins and relatives who'd been too afraid to speak up before I realized something. The family I'd lost had never been real. But the family I was finding, united by shared trauma and the courage to finally speak truth, might be. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver felt like a fortress of justice as I wheeled myself through security 3 weeks after my surgery. The preliminary hearing for my parents' bail review had drawn more attention than anyone expected. Word had spread through various victim networks, and the courtroom gallery was packed with faces I didn't recognize, but whose stories I was beginning to know intimately. Jennifer had prepared me for my parents' strategy, but nothing could have prepared me for my mother's performance when she took the stand. Gone was the raging woman from the hospital. In her place sat a frail-looking, elderly woman in a conservative dress I'd never seen before, dabbing at her eyes with tissues while speaking in a trembling voice. "Your Honor, Margaret," began her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell the truth about what's really happening here. This isn't about money or houses. This is about a desperate mother trying to save her daughter from herself. Barry has been struggling with addiction for years. We moved in not to take advantage, but to help her." The lies flowed like water, each more elaborate than the last. According to Margaret, I'd been stealing from my company to support a drug habit. The security footage showing their crimes, deepfakes created by my tech connections. The money they'd taken, they were saving it from my dealer. The injury they'd caused, a cry for help from a daughter spiraling out of control. But then she played what she thought was her ace. "Your Honor, I've been hiding something out of shame and maternal protection. I've developed a gambling problem. It started small, just scratch-off tickets, but it grew. I've lost everything, and I owe dangerous people $40,000. That's the only reason we needed Barry's help. We were desperate, not criminal." For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of sympathy. The tears looked real. The shame seemed genuine. Maybe underneath all the manipulation, there was still a human being who'd made terrible choices out of desperation. Then Jennifer leaned over and showed me her phone. The FBI had pulled Margaret's online activity from the morning of her arrest. She'd been playing online poker while federal agents surrounded the house, even as she claimed to be reformed. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Dana Rodriguez, dismantled Margaret's story with surgical precision. She presented records showing Margaret's gambling went back 12 years long before any supposed desperation. She showed patterns of gambling binges that coincided with major thefts from family members. Most damning, she presented communications between Margaret and her bookie from just 3 days ago, negotiating a payment plan that involved money she expected to extract from me through the property fraud. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez said, holding up a printed email, "This message from you to Vincent Moretti specifically states, quote, 'The gambling story will generate sympathy if we're caught. Judges eat that sob story up.' You wrote this 2 weeks before your daughter's injury. Were you planning your defense before you'd even committed the crime?" Margaret's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of rage crossing her features before the tears resumed. It wasn't like that. Vincent was helping us understand our rights as tenants. Everything got twisted. You have to understand when you're desperate when you owe money to people who threaten to hurt your family. That's when the first surprise witness was called. A woman I'd never seen before took the stand, introducing herself as Diane Hoffman from Las Vegas. She ran a legitimate debt collection agency and had been tracking my mother for 5 years, the dangerous people Margaret owed money to. They were credit card companies and legal online gambling sites. There were no mob connections, no threats of violence, just a woman who'd maxed out dozens of credit cards in various names and thought she could run forever. The second surprise came when Harold took his turn. His strategy was different but equally cruel. He stood tall, projecting an image of patriarchal authority as he made his argument. "Your Honor, I've been protecting my wife and daughter for 40 years. Harold began, his voice steady and deep. "But I can't protect them anymore. The truth is, Barry isn't my biological daughter. I've raised her as my own, loved her despite knowing she was the product of my wife's affair. But blood tells Your Honor. Her real father was a con artist who disappeared before she was born. She's following in his footsteps, creating elaborate schemes to destroy the people who actually raised her." The courtroom gasped. Even Margaret looked shocked at this twist. I felt my world tilt despite knowing it was a lie. The cruelty of the accusation, the attempt to invalidate our entire relationship with a single claim, took my breath away. But Jennifer was ready. She presented not just the DNA test I'd done years ago for medical screening, but also Harold's own medical records from 28 years ago, showing fertility treatments around the time of my conception. She had photos from my baby book, lovingly annotated in Harold's handwriting. Most devastatingly, she had a recording from the security cameras of Harold 3 months ago, drunk and rambling to Margaret about how proud he'd been when I was born, how I looked just like his mother. Rodriguez drove the final nail in. Mr. Chen, you've testified under oath that Barry isn't your daughter. Yet in this recorded conversation from your wife's seized phone, you're heard saying, quote, "She's too much like me, that's the problem. Same stubborn streak, same need to be right. If she wasn't so definitely my kid, this would be easier." Would you like to reconsider your testimony before perjury charges are added to your case? Harold's composure cracked. He started ranting about ungrateful children, about the sacrifices he'd made, about how the world owed him more than he'd gotten. The judge had to call for order as Harold shouted about his right to compensation for raising a child who wouldn't even share her success. It was the real Harold finally showing through, the one who believed children were investments that should pay dividends. But the day's biggest revelation came from an unexpected source. During a recess, a woman approached Jennifer in the hallway. She was in her 50s, professionally dressed, but with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying secrets too long. She introduced herself as Patricia Novak, a financial investigator for the IRS. "I've been building a case against the Chens for 3 years," Patricia explained. "Their marriage and divorce scheme alone constitutes major tax fraud. But there's something else. Something that might help your client understand the full scope of what she's dealing with." Patricia had discovered that my parents had been married and divorced, not 3 times, but 5, each time in different states, each time with different financial declarations. But more importantly, she'd found records of dependents claimed on various tax returns, dependents who didn't match any known children. Your client has at least 4 half-siblings, Patricia revealed, all abandoned when they were no longer financially useful. "I've been trying to track them down, but your parents were good at covering their tracks. With this arrest, though, we might finally be able to find them." Back in the courtroom for the afternoon session, the judge had clearly heard enough. He denied bail for both parents, citing flight risk and the scope of their alleged crimes. But before gaveling the session closed, he addressed them directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, in my 20 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a calculated pattern of exploitation within a family. Your attempts to manipulate this court with false medical claims, fake DNA stories, and manufactured sympathy have only reinforced the prosecution's case. You've shown no remorse, taken no responsibility, and continue to blame your victim even now. Bail is denied. You'll remain in federal custody, pending trial." As court officers led them away, Margaret turned to look at me one last time. The mask was completely gone now, replaced by naked hatred. "You'll regret this," she mouthed silently. Harold didn't even look back. They were strangers to me now, criminals who happened to share my DNA but nothing else. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer fielded calls from media outlets wanting to cover the story. The case had captured public attention as an extreme example of family fraud and elder abuse in reverse. But I wasn't interested in publicity. I was interested in Patricia Novak's revelation about siblings I'd never known existed. That evening, Patricia came to my hotel with files she was legally able to share. 4 names, 4 faces in old photographs, 4 stories of abandonment. Grace in Michigan, Daniel in Florida, Sarah in Arizona, and Michael in Oregon. All born during the years my parents were supposedly struggling to raise me. All left behind when their usefulness expired. "They'll be hard to find," Patricia warned. "Your parents were good at disappearing and reinventing themselves. These siblings might not even know their real last names. But with the FBI's resources and the public attention this case is getting, we might have a chance." As I studied the photographs of brothers and sisters I'd never known, I felt a strange mix of grief and hope. Grief for the childhood we'd been denied, the relationship stolen by our parents' greed. Hope that maybe from the ashes of this destroyed family, something real could grow. We were all victims of the same criminals, bound by DNA and betrayal. Perhaps that was enough foundation to build something better than what we'd lost. The main event began 6 months after my injury on a crisp April morning that felt more like Judgment Day than just another court date. The federal trial of United States versus Harold and Margaret Chen had drawn national media attention as a landmark case in family fraud prosecution. Court TV was broadcasting live, and the gallery was packed with victims' rights advocates, legal scholars, and more than a dozen of my parents' victims from across the country. I'd spent the morning in Jennifer's office going over my testimony one final time. The cast on my ankle had been replaced with a walking boot, but I still used a cane for stability. The physical healing was progressing well. The emotional healing was another matter entirely. Remember, Jennifer, coach, they're going to try to provoke you. Their entire defense strategy hinges on painting you as unstable, vindictive, and cruel. Don't give them ammunition. Stay calm, stick to facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case. 23 counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence included 600 hours of security footage, thousands of financial documents, and testimony from 43 witnesses across 15 states. But my parents had hired new lawyers, expensive ones, funded by money they'd hidden offshore, and they were prepared to fight dirty. When we entered the courtroom, I was shocked by my parents' appearance. Gone were the orange jumpsuits and defeated postures from preliminary hearings. Margaret wore an elegant suit that made her look like a respectable grandmother. Harold was in a crisp shirt and tie, his gray hair neatly trimmed. They'd been coached to perfection, projecting an image of confused elderly parents caught up in their daughter's corporate vendetta. The prosecution opened with Dana Rodriguez laying out the scope of the conspiracy. Using charts and timelines, she showed how my parents had systematically defrauded family members for 2 decades, stealing over $800,000 through various schemes. She played security footage of them planning my injuries, celebrating their thefts, and coaching each other on manipulation tactics. But it was when she called me to the stand that the real drama began. As I made my way to the witness box, leaning on my cane, I caught my mother's eye. She was crying again, reaching out toward me as if yearning for reconciliation. Several jurors noticed the gesture. It was perfectly calculated theater. "State your name for the record," Rodriguez began. "Barry Chen," I replied, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. The questions started simply establishing facts about my parents, moving in the timeline of events, the discovery of theft. I kept my answers brief and factual, resisting the urge to editorialize. Then Rodriguez showed the security footage from the morning of my injury. "Can you describe what you see in this video?" she asked. I watched myself on the screen, hurrying down the stairs, catching my foot on the deliberately loosened carpet, falling in a cascade of limbs and pain. Even knowing it was coming, I flinched at the impact. "That's me falling down the stairs in my home at approximately 6:20 on October 15th, I said. "You can see my foot catching on the carpet runner that had been secure the night before." "And what happened after you fell?" I described lying on the floor, calling for help, being ignored and mocked. Rodriguez played the corresponding audio, my desperate pleas, contrasting with my parents' callous responses. Several jurors looked disgusted. One elderly woman had tears in her eyes. But then came cross-examination, and my parents' lead attorney, a shark named William Thornton, went for blood. Ms. Chen Thornton began, his voice oozing false sympathy. "This must be very difficult for you, testifying against the people who raised you, who sacrificed everything for you. Tell me, when did you first start resenting your parents?" "I don't resent them," I replied carefully. "I'm heartbroken by their choices." "Their choices, or your interpretation of their choices?" Thornton produced a document. "This is your journal from high school. You wrote, and I quote, "I hate how poor we are. I hate that mom shops at thrift stores. I'm embarrassed by our apartment." Sounds like resentment to me. Jennifer objected, but the damage was done. Thornton continued pulling quotes from my teenage years, painting a picture of a spoiled child who'd always looked down on her struggling parents. He brought up every fight, every moment of teenage rebellion, every time I'd been less than a perfect daughter. "You make $300,000 a year, correct?" he asked. "While your parents were living on Social Security." "They weren't living on Social Security," I protested. "They were living on money they stole from family members." "Allegedly stole," Thornton corrected. "But let's talk about your mental health, Ms. Chen. You've been in therapy since college, correct? Anxiety, depression, trust issues." And there it was, the attempt to pathologize my normal response to childhood trauma. But Rodriguez had prepared me for this. I took a deep breath and met his gaze directly. "Yes, I've been in therapy. It's helped me understand patterns of manipulation and abuse that I normalized growing up. It's helped me set healthy boundaries and recognize toxic behavior." Thornton tried several more angles, bringing up work, stress-failed relationships, even a college roommate who described me as controlling. But each attack fell flat against the simple truth of the video evidence. No amount of character assassination could explain away my parents planning and executing a scheme to injure and rob me. The real fireworks came when Harold took the stand in his own defense. Against his lawyer's advice, he'd insisted on testifying. His ego wouldn't let him stay silent while others told his story. It was a fatal mistake. Harold started strong, portraying himself as a loving father who'd made mistakes out of desperation. He admitted to taking money but claimed it was borrowed, not stolen. He admitted to the gambling but said it was a coping mechanism for stress. He even admitted to lying about the DNA test, claiming it was a moment of pain and anger. But then Rodriguez began her cross-examination, and Harold's composure crumbled. "Mr. Chen," she began pulling up a video clip. "Can you explain this conversation where you're discussing how to, quote, break Barry's spirit and make her dependent on us?" Harold's face flushed. "That's taken out of context. We were worried about her mental health. Sometimes tough love requires—" "Breaking someone's spirit is tough love," Rodriguez interrupted. "What about this clip where you're laughing about your sister-in-law, Dorothy, dying alone and confused after you stole her life savings?" Harold's mask slipped completely. "That old bat had millions hidden away," he snarled. "She lived like a pauper while we struggled. Family is supposed to share. She owed us." The courtroom was silent except for the court reporter's keys. Harold, realizing his mistake, tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. He'd revealed his true nature, a man who believed the world owed him whatever he could take. Margaret's testimony was more controlled but equally damaging. She stuck to her story about gambling addiction and desperation, but Rodriguez had receipts for everything. Every lie was countered with evidence, every manipulation exposed with video proof. By the end, Margaret was openly weeping, but they were tears of rage, not remorse. The most powerful moment came when Marcus testified via video link from Texas, describing his mother's final year after my parents' theft. He brought photographs of Dorothy showing a vibrant woman reduced to a shell by betrayal. His testimony was followed by a parade of victims, each telling their story of trust exploited and lives damaged. But the prosecution saved their most devastating witness for last. A young woman named Grace Chen, 28 years old, from Michigan, my half-sister. The FBI had found her working as a social worker helping elderly victims of fraud. She'd changed her last name years ago, but agreed to testify when she learned about the case. Grace told the court about being abandoned at age 5 when our parents' scheme in Detroit fell apart. She'd been left with neighbors who eventually adopted her. She'd grown up wondering why her parents didn't want her carrying that rejection like a wound that never healed. Her adoptive parents had tried to track down Harold and Margaret, but found only empty addresses and false names. "I spent 20 years thinking I was unlovable." Grace testified, her voice steady but eyes wet. "Thinking I'd done something wrong to make my parents leave. Now I know the truth. I was just no longer profitable." When the scheme failed, they cut their losses. I was one of those losses. The defense had no questions for Grace. What could they possibly ask? How do you cross-examine abandoned children without looking like monsters? Harold stared at the table while Margaret continued her performance of tears, but the jury wasn't watching them. They were watching Grace and me, two sisters seeing each other for the first time across a courtroom united by the criminals who'd given us life and nothing else. Closing arguments took a full day. The defense painted my parents as desperate people who'd made bad choices but didn't deserve to die in prison. The prosecution methodically laid out 2 decades of calculated cruelty, of families destroyed and trust weaponized. Rodriguez ended with the security footage of me lying on the floor begging for help that wouldn't come. This isn't a case about desperate parents making mistakes, she told the jury. This is a case about predators who happen to have children. Predators who viewed those children not as beloved daughters and sons to nurture but as investments to eventually harvest. Barry Chen was their retirement plan. When she proved too strong to break, they tried to destroy her. That's not desperation. That's evil. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. As the foreman stood to read the verdict, I reached for Grace's hand. She'd stayed after testifying this sister I'd never known existed. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. The word rang out 23 times, each one a vindication and a wound. My parents showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. They'd played their final cards and lost. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month and denied their request to remain free on bail pending appeal. As court officers led them away in handcuffs, Harold finally looked at me. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been regret, or maybe I just wanted to see it. Margaret never looked back. Her last words, spoken loud enough for everyone to hear, were, "I should have had that abortion." Outside the courthouse, the media waited with questions I wasn't ready to answer. But Grace stood beside me, along with Daniel and Sarah, the other siblings, who'd been found and had come for the verdict. We'd lost the parents we'd never really had, but we'd found each other, and that maybe was the beginning of something worth saving. 2 weeks after the verdict, I sat in a conference room at the FBI's Denver field office surrounded by bankers' boxes and evidence boards that looked like something from a conspiracy thriller. Special Agent Maria Santos, who'd taken point on the financial crimes aspect of the case, had called me in to discuss what she termed significant developments in the ongoing investigation. "Your parents' conviction was just the tip of the iceberg," Agent Santos explained, gesturing to a wall covered in photographs, documents, and connecting threads. "We've uncovered a nationwide network of family fraud that's been operating for over 20 years. Your parents weren't just criminals. They were part of an organized system." The investigation had expanded far beyond Harold and Margaret. Vincent Moretti, the disbarred attorney who'd coached them, had flipped immediately when faced with federal charges. His testimony revealed a sophisticated operation that trained people to exploit family relationships for profit. They had manuals, training seminars disguised as self-help workshops, even a mentorship program for new recruits. But the most disturbing revelation came from forensic accountants who'd traced the money. My parents hadn't just stolen from family members. They'd been using deceased relatives' identities to commit fraud on a massive scale. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins who'd passed away had their Social Security numbers resurrected for credit applications, benefit claims, and tax fraud. Your grandmother Evelyn, who died in 2018, Agent Santos said gently, has been very busy since her death. According to our records, she's opened 14 credit cards, claimed unemployment in 3 states, and even voted in the last 2 elections. I felt sick. Grandma Evelyn had been the only relative who'd shown me consistent kindness growing up. To know they desecrated her memory for profit was a violation beyond words. That's not all, Santos continued. We found evidence of life insurance policies taken out on various family members without their knowledge, including you. 7 different policies totaling $2.5 million, all purchased in the last year. The implication hung heavy in the air, My fall down the stairs might not have been intended to just injure me. If I'd hit my head differently, if my neck had twisted another way, my parents would have been millionaires. The thought that they'd literally calculated my death value made me excuse myself to vomit in the bathroom. When I returned, Santos had pulled up another board, this one covered in photographs of children. "Your siblings," she explained. "We've found 7 so far, not including you. Grace, Daniel, Sarah, and Michael you know about. But there are 3 others." The photos showed babies and toddlers, the most recent from only 5 years ago. My parents in their 60s had still been creating and abandoning children as part of their schemes. Each child represented a benefits fraud opportunity, a sob story for relatives, a manipulation tool that could be discarded when no longer useful. One child, a boy named Christopher, had been left at a fire station in Nevada, with a note claiming the parents had died in a car accident. Another, a girl named Amy, had been abandoned with a church in Missouri. The youngest, Thomas, had been sold to a couple in California who thought they were adopting through a legitimate agency my parents had created, using fake credentials. "We're working on reuniting all the siblings," Santos said. "Some were adopted into good families and may not want contact. Others, like Grace, have been searching for answers their whole lives. We'll let you know who's interested in connecting." The investigation had also revealed the full extent of my parents' identity theft network. They'd been collecting personal information from every family gathering, every reunion, every funeral, birth certificates, social security cards, financial records, all photographed or stolen during visits. They had a storage unit in Kansas filled with filing cabinets containing the identities of over 300 relatives, living and dead. But the most shocking discovery came from an unexpected source. The FBI had been contacted by Interpol regarding similar schemes in Canada and Mexico. My parents had international connections, part of a larger network that operated across borders. The investigation now involved multiple agencies and countries. Jennifer arrived as Santos was explaining the international component. She'd been meeting with federal prosecutors about the additional charges being filed. The original 23 counts were being expanded to over 100, including charges that could result in life sentences. "There's something else," Jennifer said, her expression grim. The storage unit in Kansas contained more than just identity documents. There were photographs, videos, recordings of family members in compromising or vulnerable situations. Your parents were building blackmail files on everyone they knew. I thought about every family gathering, every moment of perceived intimacy, and wondered if it had all been intelligence gathering. Had any moment of my childhood been genuine, or was it all preparation for eventual exploitation? Santos pulled out a laptop and showed me a spreadsheet my father had maintained. It listed every family member, their estimated net worth, their vulnerabilities, and projected profit potential. I was listed near the top with notes about my earning potential in tech and psychological weaknesses to exploit. Beside my name was a column marked harvest date, with the month they'd moved in with me. Other relatives had similar notations, some marked as depleted, others as in progress, a few tagged as future opportunities, including young cousins who hadn't even finished school yet. The cold calculation of it, the reduction of family to profit margins, was breathtaking in its cruelty. "We need your help," Santos said. "You know these people better than anyone. Can you identify the relationships, verify the information, help us contact victims who might not even know they've been victimized?" I agreed, though the task felt overwhelming. Going through those documents meant reliving every family connection through the lens of exploitation. But if it helped bring justice to other victims and prevented future crimes, I had to do it. Over the following days, I worked with FBI analysts to decode my parents' records. We identified victims across generations, from elderly relatives who'd lost retirement savings to young adults whose credit had been destroyed before they'd even started their careers. The scope was staggering. But among the darkness, there were moments of light. Victims who'd suffered in silence for years finally felt validated. Family members who'd been turned against each other by my parents' lies began reconnecting. A cousin in Ohio who'd been convinced I was a drug addict reached out to apologize and share her own story of manipulation. The investigation also revealed heroes within the family. An uncle who'd quietly warned relatives about my parents for years, keeping detailed records despite being dismissed as paranoid. A second cousin who'd refused to give them access to her children, despite intense family pressure. They'd seen through the facade and tried to sound the alarm, but my parents were expert at discrediting threats. By the end of the week, the FBI had enough evidence to file charges that would ensure my parents never walked free again. But more importantly, they'd exposed a criminal network that had operated in shadow for decades. Training materials were seized, websites, shut down bank accounts, frozen. The entire ecosystem of family fraud was being systematically destroyed. As I left the FBI office on Friday afternoon, Agent Santos handed me a flash drive. These are the photos from the storage unit that aren't evidence, she said. Family pictures your parents kept probably for identification purposes. I thought you might want them. That evening, I sat with Grace, Daniel, and Sarah, the siblings, who lived close enough to gather, and we went through the photos together. There were images of grandparents we'd never meet, aunts and uncles we'd been told were dead cousins we'd been warned to avoid. Our parents had stolen not just money, but entire relationships, entire histories. But they hadn't stolen our future. As we sat together, strangers bound by blood and betrayal, sharing stories and slowly learning to trust, I realized something important. Our parents had created us as tools for their schemes, but we'd become something they never intended: a real family, forged not by manipulation, but by mutual understanding and shared survival. The investigation would continue for months, maybe years. More victims would come forward. More crimes would be revealed, but we'd already won the only victory that truly mattered. We'd found each other, and unlike our parents' twisted version of family, what we were building was real. 6 months into the federal investigation, my phone rang with an unknown number from Oregon. I'd learned to answer these calls as they often brought new siblings or cousins out of the woodwork. This time, the voice on the other end was young, nervous, and achingly familiar, even though I'd never heard it before. Hi, is this Barry? My name is Jessica Chen. I think Harold and Margaret are my biological parents. I saw the news coverage, and I've been trying to work up the courage to call for weeks. Jessica was 22, a college senior studying social work at Portland State University. She'd been left at a hospital in Salem when she was 3 days old, adopted by a loving family who'd told her the truth about her origins when she turned 18. She'd been searching for her biological parents ever since hiring private investigators who found only dead ends and false names. I never imagined this, Jessica said, her voice shaking. I used to fantasize about why they gave me up. Maybe they were too young or too poor or in danger. I created all these scenarios where they loved me but couldn't keep me. Finding out they're criminals who abandoned multiple children, I don't know how to process it. I invited her to Denver to meet the siblings who'd been gathering regularly. There were 9 of us now, ranging from 35 to 19. Each meeting brought new revelations as we pieced together our shared history from fragments and lies. Grace had become our unofficial coordinator, using her social work skills to help us navigate the complex emotions of our situation. She'd created a private online group where we could share memories, documents, and DNA test results. The genetics were fascinating in a horrible way. We were scattered across years and states, but the DNA didn't lie. Harold and Margaret had been prolific in their creation and abandonment of children. The most recent addition to our group was Marcus Jr., not to be confused with our cousin Marcus from Texas. Jr. was 19, abandoned in Florida at age 4, and had spent his childhood in foster care. Unlike some of us who'd found loving adoptive families, Jr. had bounced between homes, always wondering why he wasn't wanted. He'd aged out of the system, carrying anger that finally had a target. They created me as a prop for a con Jr. asked during one of our gatherings. Like I was just a tool to be discarded when the job was done. It was Daniel, Quiet Daniel, who worked as a pediatric nurse in Miami, who answered. They created us, yes. But we decided who we became. Look around this room. Social workers, nurses, teachers, engineers, counselors. Every one of us chose to help people instead of hurt them. We're their children, but we're not them. These meetings weren't just sibling reunions. They were therapy sessions, support groups, and strategy meetings rolled into one. We shared stories of abandonment, but also of survival. Sarah told us about the teacher who'd noticed her struggling and became her mentor. Michael talked about his adoptive parents who'd loved him through his anger and identity struggles. Grace credited her adoptive family's honesty about her origins with inspiring her career helping fraud victims. But it was Jessica's story that revealed the final piece of our parents' cruelty. She'd been born with a heart defect requiring expensive surgery. The hospital had been preparing charity paperwork when Harold and Margaret vanished, leaving their sick infant behind. They'd abandoned her not just because their scheme had failed, but because she was defective merchandise that would cost more than she could earn. Jessica had undergone successful surgery thanks to the hospital's charity program and grown up healthy. But the medical records she'd obtained showed our parents had tried to take out a life insurance policy on her before learning about the heart condition. When she became a liability instead of an asset, they'd walked away without backward glance. The rage in the room was palpable. Even those of us who'd found peace with our abandonment felt fresh fury at this revelation. But Jessica herself was surprisingly calm. "I used to think there was something wrong with me that made them leave," she explained. "Now I know there was something wrong with them. My heart defect saved me from growing up with monsters. In a twisted way, being sick was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me." As we continued meeting, we discovered we weren't the only family finding connection through tragedy. The FBI's investigation had prompted dozens of our parents' victims to reach out to each other. Cousins who'd been turned against each other were reconciling. Elderly relatives who'd suffered in isolated shame were finding support. A network of healing was growing from the poison our parents had spread. We decided to formalize our support system, creating the Chen Family Fraud Survivors Foundation. Despite sharing the name that had brought us pain, we voted to keep it, reclaiming it from the criminals who'd tainted it. Grace took point on the legal paperwork while I handled funding, using part of my savings that my parents hadn't managed to steal. Our first official act was reaching out to the FBI's other identified victims. We offered support resources and, most importantly, understanding. Who better to help family fraud victims than those who'd survived it themselves? The response was overwhelming. Within a month, we had over 50 members and were fielding calls from across the country. One call stood out. An elderly woman named Ruth from Nebraska had lost her life savings to relatives running a similar scheme. She'd been too ashamed to report it, too heartbroken to fight back. But seeing our story on the news had given her courage. "I thought I was alone," Ruth said during a video support session. "I thought I was stupid for trusting family. But seeing all of you speaking out, fighting back, building something good from something terrible, it gives me hope. Maybe I'm not too old to start over." We connected Ruth with pro bono legal services and helped her navigate the reporting process. Her relatives were arrested within weeks, part of the larger network the FBI was dismantling. Ruth became one of our most active members, using her experience to help other elderly victims recognize the warning signs of family fraud. As the foundation grew, so did our family bonds. We celebrated Jessica's graduation together, 9 siblings who'd been strangers a year ago now, cheering in the audience. We supported Junior through his first semester of community college, pooling resources to help with expenses. We grieved together when Michael's adoptive father passed, surrounding him with the biological family he'd never known he needed. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during Thanksgiving. We decided to host a gathering for all the siblings who could attend, plus supportive cousins and the adoptive families who'd raised us. It was chaotic, with multiple turkey preparations and clashing family traditions, but it was real. As we went around the table sharing gratitudes, the theme was consistent. We were thankful for finding each other, thankful for the families who'd raised us with love, thankful for the strength to survive and thrive despite our origins. When it came to Junior, usually so angry and guarded his voice broke. "I'm thankful that we're proof they were wrong," he said. "They thought we were worthless, disposable. But look at us. We're doctors and teachers and social workers. We're helping people. We're a real family. They tried to break us before we even started, and we won anyway." That evening, as I helped clear dishes alongside siblings, I was still learning to know I thought about the family I'd dreamed of having while growing up lonely and neglected. This wasn't what I'd imagined. It was messier, more complicated, born from trauma rather than love. But it was genuine in a way my childhood had never been. My phone buzzed with a notification from our foundation's website. Another victim had reached out for help. Another family was beginning to heal. Another proof that cycles of abuse could be broken, that children of criminals could choose compassion, that families could be built on truth instead of lies. The Phoenix was a myth about resurrection through fire. We hadn't asked to be burned by our parents' crimes. But from those ashes, we'd risen as something they'd never expected and couldn't control good people who'd found each other and refused to perpetuate the pain. We were Harold and Margaret's greatest failure and our own greatest success. The call came at 3 a.m, exactly 1 year after my injury. My security system app showed movement in my backyard, multiple figures approaching the house in the darkness. But this time, I was ready. The FBI had been tracking my parents' communications from federal prison and discovered they'd orchestrated one final scheme from behind bars. Using contraband cell phones and connections in their fraud network, Harold and Margaret had arranged for associates to rob my house while I was supposedly at a conference in San Francisco. What they didn't know was that the FBI had intercepted their communications weeks ago. My trip was fake. The house was surrounded by federal agents, and every moment was being recorded by upgraded security cameras with night vision and audio. I watched from my bedroom as 4 figures approached my back door with professional tools. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly experienced in breaking and entering. The woman picking the lock looked familiar, and I realized with a start that I'd seen her in my parents' visitor logs. She was another daughter, one we hadn't found yet, still caught in their web. The FBI agents waited until all 4 were inside to spring the trap. The arrests were swift and professional. No drama or violence, just criminals caught red-handed with burglary tools and detailed plans of my house drawn by Harold from memory. But the real shock came when the agents unmasked the 4th burglar. Vincent Moretti Jr., son of my parents' legal advisor, barely 18, and already following in the family business. In his backpack, agents found detailed plans to rob all 9 identified siblings' homes in a coordinated strike. They'd mapped our addresses, schedules, security systems, everything needed for a multi-state crime spree that would have netted millions. The dawn raid on my house was just one of 15 simultaneous operations across the country. The FBI had used my parents' prison communications to map the entire remaining network. By sunrise, 43 people were in custody, including lawyers, accountants, and even a judge who'd been taking bribes to rule favorably in family fraud cases. Agent Santos called me as the sun came up. "Your parents thought they were untouchable even from prison. They were wrong. This is the end of their network. Every contact, every associate, every resource they had on the outside is gone." But the morning surprises weren't over. The unknown daughter arrested at my house was Stephanie Chen, 25, who'd been raised by Harold and Margaret until age 10. Unlike the rest of us who'd been abandoned, Stephanie had been kept and trained, groomed to be their protege in crime. When she'd shown reluctance to hurt people, they'd abandoned her too, but not before ensuring she was too damaged to live normally. Stephanie was processed separately from the career criminals, and Jennifer arranged for me to meet her at the federal detention center. She looked like a Chen, same dark hair and stubborn chin, but her eyes held a deadness that made my heart ache. "You're the golden child," Stephanie said, her voice flat. "The one who got away. They talked about you constantly in prison, how you'd ruined everything, how you'd turned the family against them. They said if I helped hurt you, I'd be welcomed back." "There was no family to be welcomed back to," I told her gently. Just two criminals who used and discarded children like broken tools. You're their victim, not their ally. Stephanie broke down then, 10 years of manipulation and abandonment crashing over her. Through tears, she revealed the full extent of our parents' prison operations. They'd been running new schemes from behind bars using a network of corrupt guards and fellow inmates. They'd even been teaching fraud classes to other prisoners, spreading their poison to a new generation of criminals. The FBI used Stephanie's information to launch a massive investigation into corruption at the federal facility. Within days, 6 guards were arrested, the warden was under investigation, and my parents were transferred to Supermax facilities where their communications would be completely cut off. Their final court appearance for the new charges was a media circus. News crews from around the world covered what had become known as the most extensive family fraud case in U.S. history. My siblings and I attended together a united front of survivors, facing our abusers one last time. Harold and Margaret looked diminished in their shackles and isolation. No phone access meant no schemes. No schemes meant no power. They were just 2 aging criminals facing life sentences with no possibility of manipulation or escape. The judge, Honorable Patricia Williams, had reviewed thousands of pages of evidence and hundreds of victim impact statements. Her opening remarks set the tone for what would be a historic sentencing. In 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered criminals who so systematically weaponize the bonds of family. Judge Williams began. You didn't just steal money. You stole trust, love, and the very concept of family from dozens of victims. You created and abandoned children as casually as one might discard a broken appliance. You turned the sacred trust between parent and child into a commodity to be exploited. When offered the chance to speak, Harold launched into a rambling diatribe about ungrateful children and a system rigged against honest people. He was cut off after 5 minutes of increasingly incoherent ranting. Margaret took a different approach, turning on the tears one final time. "I'm a sick woman," she sobbed. "Gambling addiction is a disease. I never meant for any of this to happen. If my children had just helped me instead of abandoning me, none of this would have happened." The judge was unmoved. "Mrs. Chen, the evidence shows you've been claiming gambling addiction as an excuse for 20 years. You've stolen from cancer patients' orphans and your own infant children. Your tears are as calculated as your crimes." The sentences were consecutive, not concurrent. Wire fraud, mail fraud tax. Evasion, identity theft, conspiracy, attempted murder, and racketeering under RICO statutes. The numbers added up to functional life sentences several times over. Harold received 340 years. Margaret received 320. They would die in prison alone and forgotten, except as case studies in criminal psychology textbooks. As they were led away for the last time, Margaret turned to look at her 9 children sitting together. For just a moment, her mask dropped completely. The naked hatred in her eyes was chilling, but it was also clarifying. She'd never loved us. We'd never been anything but marks to her. The fantasy of the loving mother, corrupted by circumstances, died in that moment, and with it, the last of my guilt. Outside the courthouse, our group faced the media together. Grace, as our spokesperson, delivered a statement we'd crafted together. Today, justice was served not just for us, but for every victim of family fraud who suffered in silence. Our biological parents chose crime over children, greed over love. But we chose differently. We chose to find each other, support each other, and build the family they denied us. We are proof that cycles of abuse can be broken, that good can come from evil, that love is stronger than blood. The reporters shouted questions about forgiveness, about healing, about our plans for the future. But we'd said what we needed to say. Arms-linked siblings who'd been strangers united by survival. We walked away from the courthouse and toward the life we were building together. That evening, we held a celebration at my house, the same house where I'd laid broken on the floor exactly 1 year ago. The rooms that had echoed with manipulation and cruelty now rang with genuine laughter. Children of my siblings played in the backyard where criminals had tried to break in just that morning. We cooked together in the kitchen where my parents had plotted my destruction. Stephanie was there too on house arrest, but welcomed into our strange family. She had a long road ahead, years of therapy and legal consequences for her involvement in the crimes. But she also had something she'd never had before: siblings who understood her damage and loved her anyway. As the night wound down, Junior raised a toast. To the family we chose, he said, lifting his glass of sparkling cider. To the parents who failed us and the siblings who didn't. To justice served and futures reclaimed. To us. We clinked glasses, 9 damaged people who'd found wholeness in each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Stephanie's legal battles, ongoing therapy, the work of our foundation, the complex process of healing from a lifetime of manipulation. But tonight we celebrated our victory over the criminals who'd created us to be victims. They'd lost more than their freedom. They'd lost their legacy. Instead of a network of trauma and crime, they'd inadvertently created a network of healing and justice. We were their children, but we were not their creation. We'd created ourselves, and we'd done it together. 2 years after that fateful October morning when I lay broken on my floor, I stood in that same spot, hanging a banner that read, "Welcome Home." The house that had been a crime scene was about to become something beautiful, the first official meeting space for the Chen Family Fraud Survivors Foundation. My siblings and I had pooled resources to purchase the houses on either side of mine, creating a compound of healing where our foundation could offer support groups, legal clinics, and temporary housing for family fraud victims starting over. It felt right to transform the place where I'd almost died into a sanctuary for others escaping similar situations. The grand opening drew over 200 attendees, survivors, advocates, FBI agents who'd worked our case, and media covering what had become a movement. Agent Santos, now retired and serving on our board, cut the ribbon with tears in her eyes. "This place represents everything good that can come from tragedy," she said. "Where criminals plotted destruction, survivors now plan reconstruction. Where trust was betrayed, faith is being restored. Where a family was broken, hundreds of families are being healed." The compound included a legal aid office run by Jennifer's firm Pro Bono, a counseling center staffed by volunteer therapists, and a resource library documenting warning signs of family fraud. Grace had left her job to run our programs full-time, funded by donations that poured in from grateful families we'd helped. But the heart of the compound was the community room built where my parents' bedroom had been. The space that had harbored their schemes now hosted support groups where victims shared their stories without shame. The first meeting included Ruth from Nebraska sitting beside a young man from Maine whose grandparents had stolen his college fund, and a mother from California whose children had drained her retirement accounts. As I welcomed the group, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. My ankle still ached on rainy days, a permanent reminder of that October morning. But the physical pain had faded far faster than the emotional wounds. Those had required different medicine, truth, justice, and the discovery that family could be chosen rather than assigned by blood. Our biological family had grown to 12 confirmed siblings with DNA tests, still pending on 3 more possibilities. Each brought their own story of abandonment and survival. We met monthly sometimes to handle foundation business, but often just to exist together, proof that our parents' legacy of destruction wasn't the final word on who we were. Stephanie had completed her house arrest and probation, throwing herself into making amends by becoming our most dedicated volunteer. She used her insider knowledge of fraud networks to help law enforcement identify and prevent schemes. Her transformation from accomplice to advocate gave hope to others trapped in criminal family systems. Junior had finished his associate's degree and was starting a bachelor's program in criminal justice, determined to become an FBI agent specializing in family fraud. His anger had found purpose in protecting others from what we'd endured. Sarah had written a book about our story, donating proceeds to the foundation. Michael had started a podcast interviewing survivors of various family betrayals, creating a platform for voices too long, silenced by shame. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during our third annual Thanksgiving gathering. Jessica's adoptive parents hosted at their Oregon farm, welcoming 43 members of our ever-expanding chosen family. As we prepared dinner together, Jessica's adoptive mother, Linda, pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding her, for showing her that being abandoned wasn't her fault, for giving her biological siblings who understand parts of her we never could. You've given my daughter the missing pieces of her heart." That evening, as we shared what we were grateful for, the themes had evolved from our first gathering. We were still grateful for finding each other, but now we were also grateful for the hundreds of families we'd helped the laws changed. Because of our advocacy, the criminals stopped by our testimony. We were grateful for the ability to transform poison into medicine. The foundation had helped recover over $10 million for victims, assisted in 253 arrests, and provided support to over 1,000 families. We'd testified before Congress about the need for stronger laws protecting family fraud victims. 3 states had passed Chen laws making it easier to prosecute relatives who exploited family trust. Harold and Margaret remained in their respective Supermax facilities, all appeals exhausted. They'd attempted to contact us through various channels, sometimes threatening, sometimes pleading, always manipulating. We'd learned to recognize their communications like a familiar poison and dispose of them unopened. They were ghosts of a past we'd survived nothing more. As I stood in my transformed home that December evening, watching survivors connect over coffee and shared understanding, my phone buzzed with yet another request for help. A grandmother in Texas cleaned out by grandchildren she'd raised. A father in Michigan identity, stolen by the son he'd tried to save from addiction. A couple in Florida retirement destroyed by the daughter they'd loved too much to suspect. Each story broke my heart and steeled my resolve. The work would never be done. As long as families existed, predators would exploit those bonds. But we'd proven that survivors could become warriors, that stolen trust could be rebuilt, that families of choice could heal wounds left by families of origin. Looking around the room at faces both familiar and new, I realized the banner I'd hung that morning had been wrong. This wasn't about welcoming anyone home. Home implied a return to something that existed before. What we'd built was entirely new, a family forged in honesty rather than lies, united by healing rather than harm. Choosing connection despite every reason to remain isolated. My mother had snarled that I'd regret turning against family. She'd been wrong about that, like she'd been wrong about everything else. I regretted nothing about choosing justice over blood, truth over silence, healing over hatred. The family I'd lost had never been real. The family I'd found was everything. To those watching who've wondered if they're wrong to stand up to family members who hurt them, who've been told that blood is thicker than water, who've been made to feel guilty for protecting themselves from relatives who see them as resources rather than people, you're not alone. Family should be a source of support, not suffering. Love shouldn't come with a price tag. Trust shouldn't be a weapon. If you recognize your story in mine, please reach out. Comment below about your experiences, because sharing breaks the silence that enables abuse. Like this video if it resonated with you so others who need to hear this message can find it. Subscribe to follow more stories of survival and transformation. Share this with anyone trapped in family situations that feel wrong, because sometimes outsiders see what we're too close to recognize. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of a community that believes survivors and supports healing. May you find the courage to choose the family that chooses you, to build trust with those who earn it, and to know that walking away from toxic blood relations isn't betrayal, it's survival. Remember, you deserve family who sees your worth beyond your wallet, who celebrates your success without calculating their cut, who loves you in sickness and health without checking for profit margins. That family exists. Sometimes you're born into it. Sometimes you have to build it. Either way, it's worth finding. Until next time, this is Barry Chen, survivor, sister, and builder of better families, reminding you that the best revenge against those who tried to break you is to heal so completely that you can help others do the same. Stay strong, stay safe, and never apologize for protecting yourself from predators, no matter what DNA you share.